Salut! The first time you learned to ride a bike, did you have instant perfect balance on day one? Of course you didn't. What about the second time? What about the 10th time? Of course you didn't. So why expect perfection when learning to speak a language? Your fear of getting it wrong is holding you back. It's keeping you from being willing to make mistakes, which is keeping you from progressing, which in turn is keeping you from reaching your language goal. So, in today's episode, I'll help you unpack unhelpful beliefs about perfection and accuracy in a language learning process. Once you learn to embrace your mistakes, you will be unstoppable.
Welcome to Quirky French Podcast, the podcast that helps you speak more confidently, feel more focused, and be more in control of your French learning journey. Prêt? C'est parti!
Salut and welcome to episode 24 of Quirky French Podcast, the podcast that will help you get over your fear of speaking French and reach your dream language goal. Naima here from quirkyfrench.com, and I think I really need to have this conversation with you today because I've had to have conversations about making mistakes and embracing mistakes with my students more than once this week. It's like something's been up in the air, and I've had to remind a big portion of my students that they need to learn to let go of that fear of making mistakes. So I want to share my message with you too, dear listener. If you want to reach your language goal, and if you get nervous about making mistakes, grab yourself a cup of coffee, a smoothie, or whatever, and let's talk. Now, here's what we tend to forget. If you don't make mistakes, fine, you're not going to fail, but you won't progress either. Isn't that worse? Right? Your attitude towards making mistakes is one of the most determining factors when it comes to reaching your goal. Also, if you don't get over your fear of making mistakes, you're always going to be held back by that fear, whether you're a beginner or a more advanced learner. And I really want to stress that it is unrelated to your level in French. Holding on to that fear of making mistakes, holding on to that fear of failure is the best thing you can do if you want to stagnate and never go anywhere with your French. Brasser de l'air is what you'll be doing. That's a little phrase for today. Brasser de l'air. It means doing a lot for very little results, right? The danger is, do you know that you have this problem? Are you aware that you listening, you also have this problem? Let's explore this a bit further. Now, if I ask you right now, do you have an issue with making mistakes? Perhaps you'll give me the mature answer and say, of course not. Mistakes are part of the learning process. Yeah, we all know, the good answer that we need to say. But here's when it gets tricky. Perhaps you don't even realize that you have a problem with making mistakes, in which case your belief pattern could show up in more subtle ways. Here's an example. So I was working with a student of mine, and she kept telling herself and telling me that she could not pronounce a word. It started with an R and R, and she thought it was too difficult. She showed me her throat and said that she was literally, physically unable to produce it, as if there was something different about her physiology. Now, she has lungs, a throat, a tongue, vocal cords, everything just like me, but she was so convinced that she could not do it that she ended up telling herself that she was physically unable to pronounce the word. So instead of using that word, she just continued her speech and avoided the word altogether. Now, 10 seconds after, she tried my phonetics trick and she nailed it instantly. She didn't just do okay, she instantly nailed it. Yet, when I asked her to do it again, she said she was, again, literally, physically unable to do it because it did not feel natural. This is a perfect example of a mental block just based on the unconscious fear of making mistakes, unconscious fear of sounding weird, looking like a fool. So you need to ask yourself, what's the one thing that you just can't get yourself to do? Is it practicing your pronunciation of the French R? Is it getting outside your comfort zone and speaking to a native speaker? Is it sitting down every day to learn vocabulary? What are some things that other students can do, but for some reason you're different, you can't seem to get it? What are some things that you find so difficult that you just avoid them altogether? And perhaps you don't even realize that you're avoiding them. Perhaps you just think that you're unable to do them, so you look for alternatives, like my student. But that's the trick here. Your fear of making mistakes could be that sneaky. You just think that you're looking for alternatives, but what's really happening is that you're actually avoiding doing something difficult. And I've spotted this behavior, 3-4 times this week with my students. So it's actually really common, and it's something that we constantly, need to remind ourselves of. You really want to get to the bottom of this if you want to grow and take your French to the next level. And when you ask those questions, you'll start to uncover that more often than not, your answers are actually based on a fear of making mistakes, a fear of being vulnerable, a fear of feeling like a fool, rather than an actual, technical issue or a skill or language issue. So here's how you overcome this. What I'm going to say is cliché, but we all need to remind ourselves of this sometimes, myself included. Embrace your mistakes. Mistakes are scary, they're embarrassing, they're disappointing. No one likes to make mistakes. Or do they? I want to help you become more open about the benefits of making mistakes, because for every mistake you make, growth also happens. It's cliché, but it's so true. So, this week's Quirky tip is simple. Take a moment to answer the following questions. When you take the time to reflect on your thoughts and attitude towards mistakes, you'll be one step closer, but a big step closer to taking ownership of your mistakes and to progress. So here are the questions. What are some things I find so difficult to do that I just avoid them altogether? What am I shying away from? What activities am I so uncomfortable with that I think I just can't do them and I believe I'm unable to do them? What activities and learning methods am I skeptical about? How disappointed do I feel when I make a mistake or when I get negative feedback? Am I actually running up against a brick wall when I do this or that activity, or am I just telling myself that so that I don't have to try? Right? Food for thought. Once you answer those questions, you can start to reflect and see the root cause of your issue. Let's say, for example, you think you're terrible at conversations and you think you'll never be able to have a real conversation with a native speaker. Well, is it a fact, or is it what you tell yourself so that you can have a legitimate reason to avoid conversation practice? Right? More often than not, your avoidance will cause you to lack practice in this area. So what makes conversation extremely difficult is not that you're bad at it, it's just that you never do it, right? So instead of thinking that you're bad at something, simply ask yourself, how many times have I tried? How often do I practice it? What am I doing today to keep going? You think you can handle a real-life conversation? Well, how many conversations are you having? How often do you put yourself out there, connect with native speakers, and have conversations? Just ask yourself, and you'll see how much room for growth there could be if you stopped avoiding making mistakes in the first place. So here you are. Once you have your answers, all you need to do is get out there and go for it. Your accent will be terrible, and it's okay. You'll make tons of mistakes, and it's okay. It will be messy, it will be uncomfortable, you'll fail tons of times, and it's okay. You'll get back up again. Nobody's perfect, you're no different, and it's fantastic news. So on that note, I wish you a beautiful week, make plenty of mistakes, and I will catch up with you next week for another episode of Quirky French Podcast. And in the meantime, as always, keep learning, keep growing, and keep it quirky. Passe une excellente semaine et à la prochaine. Salut, salut. Bye.